In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up PCSX2 on Windows PC. Alright, the time has come to finally dive into PCSX2. The new QT builds are really awesome. They make a lot of the PCSX2 setup process much easier, and they're just so much better to use. I like them so much. But I've been putting this PCSX2 guide off for like 3 years, so it is time to finally dive in. So let's do it. So to get started with PCSX2 PS2 emulation, the first thing you need to do is download PCSX2. So if you head over to the PCSX2 website, click on downloads, or check the link in the description below, that'll take you right to this page, you'll get brought to the download page here. And you'll see that there's stable releases, but these are 2 years out of date, don't really recommend using them. So scroll down here to nightly builds, and you can just grab it for the platform of your choice. My tutorial is focusing purely on Windows, but the steps should also mostly apply to Linux as well. But click on your platform of choice, so for me I'm going to choose Windows, and you'll see that there are the new QT builds here. There's an AVX2 version and an SSE4 version. Now the version you're going to want to choose is dependent on your CPU's capabilities. So you could use a program like CPU-Z or CPU-Z, depending on where you live in the world. Open it up, and once it's fully opened, it'll bring you to your CPU page here, and it will have an instructions tab here, showing you all the supported instruction sets by your CPU. So if you see AVX2 on there, grab the AVX2 version. So I'm just going to get this downloaded. And once you get PCSX2 downloaded, you just need to get it extracted to whatever directory you want to store it in. So it is in 7-zip format. So if you don't have 7-zip, you could head over to the 7-zip download page and download it for your operating system. But just right-click on it, go to the 7-zip context menu, and tell it to extract it to just the PCSX2 folder, and inside you'll have all of your PCSX2 stuff. So again, just move this folder wherever you want to store it. For my demonstration purposes, I'm just going to leave it on the desktop, but if you have an emulation folder, just extract it in there. And then you can rename the folder whatever you want, so I'm just going to name it PCSX2 just for demonstration purposes again. So there we go. But inside, you'll see that there is a portable.ini file. This comes standard with the nightly builds, and this means that all of PCSX2's data is going to store within this folder, which keeps it nice and compact and contained, which I personally enjoy. But go ahead and open PCSX2 for the first time. And it should create a crap ton of folders inside of your PCSX2 main folder, which is what we want. Alright, so I'm just going to go ahead and close out of it now. So the first thing we're going to do is set up our PCSX2 BIOS, that way we can actually play games. Now you are going to need to source a PS2 BIOS for this to work. I'm not going to be providing you any illegal download links, so don't ask. It's not going to happen. If you need to dump a PS2 BIOS from your actual PS2 console, I have 2 methods on how to do that. One focusing on modded fat and slims, and one on stock slims using free DVD boot that you can use to easily just get a BIOS file. Like, this one is super nice. Or, you know, you could always resort to the shady parts of the net. I really don't care how you do it. Just, again, don't ask me for illegal download links. They're never going to be provided on my channel. So, yeah. But once you have a PS2 BIOS, I have one from my fat and slim that I dumped using those videos I showed. So here's my slim. Here's my fat. And they could be in multi-file format like this. They might be in a single file if you found them on the shady parts of the net. I don't really recommend those ones personally. Seems like people have bad experiences with them. But once you source your BIOS file, just go ahead and drag them into the BIOS folder within PCSX2. And that is now ready to go. So now when we open up PCSX2, we can go into Settings, BIOS, and it will show us the BIOS files within that BIOS folder. So for some reason it thinks my Slim was a Japanese BIOS. I really don't understand that. It's an American console, as far as I know, I guess. I mean, all the labeling on it's American. So not really sure what that's about, but anyway, I'm just going to choose the one from my fat. And there's an option down here for fast boot. So if you want PCSX2 to be region free, leave fast boot checked. That way you only need a BIOS. You can use any BIOS file, and you can play any region's games. If you have fast boot disabled, you will need a BIOS file from each region, to my understanding. But if you want the PS2 boot animation to play, just uncheck this, but again, you will need a BIOS file from each region. If you don't want it to play, just keep it checked, and then it makes it region free. So moving on, the next thing we're going to focus on is getting our game directory set up. So let's talk about PS2 games real quick. So PS2 games can be in ISO format or bin format, depending on if they were CD or DVD based games. If you're interested in backing up your own physical collection of PS2 games, I do have a guide on my channel to once again show you how to do just that. And links to this playlist will be in the description below as always, so check it out if you are interested in backing up your own physical stuff. Or again, you can resort to the shady parts of the net to source them. I really don't care, just don't ask me for illegal download links. Now let's talk about supported file formats for your PS2 games. So bin, ISO, gzip, and chud are the main supported formats for PS2 games. So I have my PS2 games in chud format. I converted these when I was doing my Xbox tutorials earlier this year. Except for my Half-Life one. I left that one in bin format because CD-based games, I really don't care about compressing them. But all my PS2 games are now in chud format. If you are interested in converting your PS2 games to chud format, I do have a PS2 ISO to chud bat file with the proper chudman.exe to go with it. Link to this will be in the description below. You put it in the same directory as your PS2 games and run the bat file, and it will convert everything to chud format. It is super simple, so link to this in the description below if you want to convert your games over to chud format and save some space. But once you have your PS2 games sourced, you have them in the format you want, you can store them literally anywhere on your computer. It doesn't matter where you put them. So for demonstration, let's just add it to my PCSX2 folder, so that way everything is literally contained in one easy to find location. So going back into PCSX2, I can add a game directory. Can choose my PS2 games folder here, select the folder, and it's going to ask you if you'd like to scan recursively. Tell it yes, so that way it'll scan games that are inside subfolders. So for example, my Multidisc games, I have them in subfolders. And it finds all of your games and lists them here in the menu. And if you want to clean it up a bit, you can. Like, you could get rid of the region, you could get rid of the file size, like, just really clean it up a little bit, make it look a little nicer in the QT menu. There's also a box art view you could do if you want to set up cover images and stuff like that. And if you want to add cover art, you can just right click on a game, set the cover image, scroll to where an image for the game is, select it, and it will have an image. But I'm just going to leave it on list view personally. So once you have your BIOS and games set up and loaded up into PCSX2, all you need to do is hook up a controller and you're pretty much ready to go on playing PS2 games with just basic settings. So I hooked up my Retro Fighters Defender controller. It defaults into X input mode. So to get this working within PCSX2, I could just go into settings, controllers, and if you have an X input controller, you can just enable X input source here, and it should list your controller types here, just ready to go. Now, the problem with most X input controllers by default, even with a controller like the Defender that supports pressure sensitive buttons on an actual PS2, that stuff doesn't work under emulation, so you don't get pressure sensitivity without using an official DualShock 3. So once again, I do have a video on the channel on how to set up a DualShock 3 for PCSX2 use, so if you are interested in using a DualShock 3 getting the full pressure sensitivity buttons, I do have this expanded guide on controller setup for that specific use case. But for basic setup, we're just going to use standard X input here. So enabled my X input source, I'm going to disable the SDL source. Then I'm going to select my controller in port 1, which is DualShock 2. You can choose controller types here if you need to. But one of the nice things about the new QT builds of PCSX2, they have an automatic button mapping tab over here. So I can just tell it to map it to my X input controller here, and it will automatically map everything that I need to use. So then I could just close out of it, and we can load up a game and see how it plays. Alright, so here we go. 007 Nightfire loaded up within PCSX2. We can check to make sure all of our controllers are working. So this game is using legacy controls of all things by default. That's interesting. Okay then. But anyway, so there we go. Up, down, right, left on my left analog stick. Right, left, down, up on my right analog stick. L2. R2. L1. R1, circle, triangle, cross doesn't do anything, square doesn't do anything. Need to do the thumbstick, start button, select button. There we go. So, controls are working as intended. And one of the cool things about the latest builds of PCSX2, if you pay attention down here, you can see that it has already set the Vulkan video backend for me by default, which is great because that is one of the better backends for PS2 emulation. But anyway, we just wanted to make sure our controller was working, and we have confirmed that, so moving on. After you have your controls set, another thing you can do is enable hotkeys directly from your controller if you want to. So hotkeys are assigned to your keyboard automatically, but if you want to do this on like a TV or something, you can set up some controller combos, like opening up the quick menu within PCSX2. You can change it to like start and back or something. So options exist, or you could just leave it on escape. Doesn't really matter. But you can go through and set hotkeys for pretty much everything. And if you are planning on playing multiplayer on your PCSX2 emulation, you can hook up another controller and configure the controller for DualShock 2 in port 2. You just need to manually set this from not connected to DualShock 2 so a second controller is registered, and then you can do the automatic button mapping or manually set things as needed. And if you have multi-tap enabled games, you can set if you have a multi-tap on port 1 or port 2, and it will add in the extra ports as shown here, and then you can go through it and connect the DualShocks to each and every port and configure the controllers as needed. And again, you can do that with port 1 as well, so you can have 8 players. Alright, so now that you have your BIOS games and a working controller, you're able to just enjoy PCSX2 emulation with your basic settings, but where's the fun in that? So let's go ahead and start configuring some things to better suit our needs. So if you head into settings, you'll see there's a bunch of setting tabs you can change in here. So, in like interface, you can, so inhibit screensaver, that makes it so your screensaver doesn't turn on, so definitely useful. If you click out of your PS2 emulation, you can make sure that the emulation will pause as you do so, if you don't want to have anything mess up or something. Pause on start, so when you start up emulation, it will pause the game. Not that useful in my opinion, but whatever. You can automatically save a state when you close out of a PS2 game. Confirm shutdown, so when you try to close a game, it'll say, are you sure you want to close this? I don't really care for that one personally, so we'll do that. But then you can also start in full screen. You can hide your mouse cursor, change your theme. And then there's the automatic updater, so you can choose whether to update to nightly or stable builds. I'd recommend leaving it on a nightly. And then automatic update check, you can enable or disable this. You can manually check for updates. And then your game list setting, you can add new paths to your game list here if you want to. Our BIOS setup, which we already did. Emulation, this is where you can set like fast forward speeds. So it's set to 200 by default, so it'll make your games run twice as fast. You can change this up to unlimited, so it'll just run as fast as your CPU will allow for, or anywhere in between. Slow motion speed, same thing. Cut it down to 50% or all the way down to 2%, 1 FPS. Leave enable speed limiter checked so that way games will run at their proper speed by default. Next up, we have frame pacing, latency control. So you can enable optimal frame pacing to just give you a better video presentation. So this can reduce input latency, but it does require you to have a really good CPU and GPU to utilize. In my PC, I can enable this without any problem. If you're on a lower end system, this could cause issues, so test it with your games on and off. Next, scale to host refresh rate. So this will adjust emulation speeds to match your monitor's refresh rate as long as you're like on a 60 Hz monitor. If you're using a VRR monitor, leave it off. So I'm using VRR, so I'm going to leave that one off. Next, under game settings, you'll see that you can enable per game settings. We want this checked. And then we also have a number of cool little features here. So if you plan on using cheats, you're going to want to enable the cheat section. If you want to use widescreen patches, you're going to want to enable that. And then no interlacing patches, again, enable it. But let's talk about getting widescreen patches, no interlacing patches, and cheats set up real quick. So once you enable these, if you head back into your PCSX2 folder, you'll see a cheats NI folder, a cheats WS folder, and just a normal cheats folder. So to get the no interlacing and widescreen patches in place, find the resources folder within your PCSX2 folder. So just scroll down, resources. and you'll see a Cheats NI and a Cheats WS zip folder here. So I'm just going to drag these to my desktop real quick. Back out there. But then I'm just going to get these extracted. So here's my Cheats NI. So if I open that up, you'll see that it has a bunch of PNAC, however you want to pronounce it. So I'm just going to select all those, cut them out, and paste them into the Cheats NI folder within PCSX2. So this enables all of the non-interlacing patches that are available. And then the same thing with the widescreen patches. Actually, we're going to show a different method here. So same thing, going to extract the Cheats WS folder. And inside, just a bunch of widescreen patches. So another method, you can just drag it in and it will merge the folders automatically. So now we have all of our widescreen codes. So if you want to download cheats for PCSX2, I personally just searched through this PCSX2 thread here. So I'll put a link to this in the description below. If you already have cheat files, that's great. But just search through here until you find codes for the game you want. So for my example, I found an Ace Combat 5 cheat code file here. So I'm just going to add that to my PCSX2 cheats folder. And I'm going to edit some of the codes. So I'm going to open up Notepad, drag the cheat file onto it. It shows me what cheats they are. And if you notice, there is a patch equals 1 entry here. So that is how you know if the cheat is on or if you want to turn it off. So for example, let's just turn off max infinite missiles. So there we go. Now we'll save it. Then I can just close out of there. And then I can load into Ace Combat 5 and see if the widescreen, no interlacing patches, and these cheats take effect. Do note when you use a lot of cheats, you might encounter some issues that make it so certain games don't work or break things. So do use cheats with caution. But up there in the top left, it showed all the cheats that were activated. So we had some non-interlacing and some widescreen and some normal cheats activated. Alright, so now that I have loaded up into the game, you can see that my cheat codes are now activated. I am firing an insane amount of missiles that you should not be able to fire normally. Drop all my bombs. But the game is now in widescreen and it is not in 480i. And then just check invincibility cheat code here. Just flew through the ground. Look at that. We have inverted the world here. Like this is interesting stuff. But there you go. A quick example on how to use all of those cheat codes and widescreen patches and no interlacing patches. Next up, enable host file system. So if you're going to be doing PS2 homebrew on your version of PCSX2, you can enable this to allow your emulated stuff to access your computer's file system. Otherwise, you could just leave this one off. And then warn about unsafe settings, leave that one on. So that way, if you have something screwed up, it will tell you, hey, these settings might not work with this game. Change them. All right, moving on. The system options. We're going to basically be ignoring most of this. This is stuff you're going to want to set on a game-by-game basis. And to do that, you're going to want to look at the PCSX2 wiki, so we're just going to leave all of this as default at the moment. And then moving on to advanced system, pretty much the same thing. We're going to leave this all just as default. And now for everyone's favorite tab, the graphics tab. So first up, renderer. This is set to automatic. It should detect what your graphics card is able to do, but you're going to want to use Vulkan or OpenGL. Those are just the two most accurate. I set mine to Vulkan, even though it's auto-detecting it to Vulkan anyway, but I just like to make sure. But now we have a bunch of stuff down here you can change. So you could change the full screen mode. Apparently not, never mind. Aspect ratio, so I like to set this on a per game basis. So for widescreen games, I do 16:9, then standard for non-widescreen games. And this is all stuff you could change on a per game basis. I'm going to go over that here in a little bit. FMV aspect ratio, deinterlacing. This is set to automatic by default, and it does a good job of choosing between bob, weave, and blend. But, I mean, you can manually set a deinterlacer as you see fit, and then you can crop each of the edges of the screen to remove black borders. And then down at the bottom, there's bilinear filtering. This is on by default, so if you want to have a bit of a rougher image, you could disable it. Integer upscaling. This is something I like to check myself. Depending on how much you are up-resing your game. It could result in a smaller game screen, but it will be a lot sharper. So I like to use it. If you don't like having black borders on your screen, disable it. VSync, you could turn this on if you want. Internal resolution screenshots, so if you enable this, it will take a screenshot at the internal resolution PCSX2 is running at, otherwise it'll be at your desktop resolution. Screen offsets, this is one that'll be useful on a per game basis, so it'll just adjust the position of where your game is being rendered on the screen according to how the game is telling it, but not needed for most things, but for ones that it is, you'll see them in the PCSX2 wiki and you can enable it there. Show overscan, so if you want to see stuff that was hidden in the overscan area of a game, you can enable that. Not really that needed, but it's fun to mess around with. Disable interlace offset. It can make some games look sharper, but I just recommend leaving it disabled. And then anti-blur, this is on by default, and I recommend leaving it there. Alright, so now for the rendering tab within the graphics tab here. So internal resolution, this is where you up-res your games. So if you have a strong GPU, go for the full 4K or higher. If you experience lag where you didn't have it before, just drop it down in value until you don't have that lag. So on my GPU, I can do the 6X just fine. MIP mapping, this is on automatic. So some games don't use MIP mapping, some do. But if you want to go for full accuracy, you can just do full PS2 MIP maps. But automatic should be good for most users. Next up, texture filtering. This is set to bilinear PS2 by default, and this is the most accurate option, but you can choose between the other ones and see what you prefer. So if you want a more PS1 texture look, you could go for nearest. It'll be a lot more blocky, but I like to go for the bilinear PS2 as it's set by default. Next up, trilinear filtering. This is set to automatic by default, but I typically tend to set mine to trilinear PS2, but you can choose the different options and see which one you prefer. Anisotropic filtering, you could crank this up to 16x if you so desire, or leave it off, or anywhere in between. Personal preference. Dithering, you could choose to turn off dithering, have it scaled with your internal resolution, or leave it unscaled. It's set to unscaled by default, so choose between which one you think looks better. CRC fix level, just leave this one on automatic. Blending accuracy, leave this one on basic. You could increase it if you want to, but you will start to encounter some performance hits as you go higher, so just be aware of that. But it does result in a more accurate image the higher you go. Next up, texture preloading. Leave this on full hash cache. Next up, GPU palette conversion. If you have a stronger GPU than CPU, this might be worth checking. If you're CPU limited, that is. If you're not CPU or GPU limited, you can just leave it off. Next up, manual hardware renderer fixes. I recommend just leaving this unchecked for most use cases, unless you really know what you're doing here. So just basic setup, leave this one off. Most games apply these fixes automatically these days, so just don't even worry about it. Next up, texture replacement. This is for all of you HD texture pack users. So by default, you will see the directory that PCSX2 is looking to use for HD textures. It's in your PCSX2 folder under textures. Right there. But to use custom textures, you just need to turn on the load textures option. And then turn on pre-cache textures, and async texture loading is fine. And then you just need to source an HD texture pack. So unfortunately, there's no real PCSX2 HD texture pack like centralized location like there is with, say, Dolphin. So you're just gonna have to search around until you can find some. So I found Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition texture pack here on GBA Temp. But just download a texture pack for a game, and once you have that texture pack downloaded, just get it extracted. And this could take a while depending on the size of the texture pack. But when the process is done, you should be left with a folder that is using the code of the game that you are trying to use the textures on. And inside that folder, it might just be a ton of textures, or it might have a folder named textures as well. But if you open it up and there's another folder with the source or the game code name, that's the folder you want to drag into your texture folder. But anyway, so I'm just going to drag this in. And there's my HD texture pack for Devil May Cry 3 Special Edition. Just going to back out of that real quick. And then you can make sure the textures will load again by making sure load textures are on, and then pre-cache them as well. And then for demonstration purposes, here's Devil May Cry 3 with an HD texture pack. Alright, so the HD texture pack really applies to the menus quite well. The text is a lot sharper, it's not as pixelated. So it is taking effect. And then textures like on the jukebox there are a lot more crisp than normal. But yes, looking really nice overall, especially when combined with no interlace patches, up-resing, and widescreen codes. So as you can see with my integer scaling on, there are black borders around the screen. Again, if you want those off, just make sure you have integer scaling off. But results in a more sharp image, which is what I prefer. I don't care if there's a little bit of black bars. But again, just a personal preference thing. So there we go. You can have this on universally, or you could just have it as a per game thing. That's just another setting you could do per game, which is really nice. Alright, next tab, on-screen display. So you can scale the OSD size. You can have notifications pop up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen when you start up. So like when it's showing you that widescreen patches and stuff are applied, you can have that show up, or you can uncheck it to disable it. You can show your CPU usage, GPU usage. This is useful if you're on a more limited system, or just if you want to have the numbers available. It's pretty cool. Resolution, speed, FPS, statistics, indicators for pausing, turbo, fast forward, things like that. Next up, shade boost. If you enable this, you can adjust brightness, contrast, and saturation, and manually set these per game, or overall. Can enable full screen anti-aliasing, and enable a TV shader. So there's a couple different available: scanline, diagonal filter, triangular filter, wave filter, and lots CRT. So you could go through these and see if there's any you prefer. Not as extensive as RetroArch shaders, but still pretty cool to have. Next up, advanced. This is another tab where I really don't recommend changing anything on unless you need to per game. And you can look up in the PCSX2 wiki if you need to change anything in here on a per game basis. Otherwise, just leave it be. Next up, the audio settings. First up, interpolation. You can change this to a number of different things. So if you have a slower CPU, you can lower the quality of your PS2 sound output, or you can just leave it on Gaussian if you have the CPU power to handle it. Synchronization, you can change between a bunch of different things. It's recommended to leave it on time stretch. Expansion, so you can enable different sound modes here. So if you have a 5.1 setup or a 7.1 setup, you can enable those here. Then you could change the output module, so you could choose it's on QBEB by default, or you could change it over to X-Audio 2. Should be fine just on default. And then you could change the latency manually, as well as time stretch settings here. Next up, memory cards. So when you first start up PCSX2, it will create 2 memory cards in port 1 and port 2 for you automatically. At any point, you can add in new memory cards. So it creates these memory cards in an actual memory card file type. Let me open this up here real quick. And if you go into the mem cards folder, there you go. So there's memory card 1 and memory card 2. These are 8 megabyte PS2 memory cards. If you want to, you could create a memory card folder, and then you could just name it something. So there you go. And now it will save all of my PS2 memory cards into just native available saves within this folder. And then you never have to worry about running out of space in your memory card. You don't have to manage them. It's pretty nice. But you could just eject the memory card you have there, and then insert into port 1 the folder. So there we go. You don't have to do that, but it just saves you time on managing memory card saves. But if you want to have a folder for memory card 2, you could do the same thing there. Again, you don't need to do this. It just makes it easier to manage your saves and import saves from other sources easily into PCSX2. But for memory card settings, you can auto-eject memory cards and loading save states. Leave that enabled if you plan on using save states. Otherwise, you can encounter some memory card corruption. So just leave these set to on like they are by default. All right, next up, network and hard drive. So PCSX2 does fully support network integration, so you could play fan servers on games like SOCOM 2, Battlefront 2, Tony Hawk 3. Like, this is pretty cool stuff, but I'm going to cover this more in depth in a different video. But the basics are you can enable it, choose your device type, choose your network adapter, and then you can set up the DNS and all that stuff to communicate with those fan-made servers. But again, I will have a separate video on how to do this. And then next, hard disk drives. So if you have a game you're trying to emulate that uses the hard drive, you can actually create a virtual hard disk image. And you can choose between 40 gigs and 120 gigs. For the most part, you shouldn't need this though. And then finally, our folder settings, so you can set a cache directory, a cover art directory, snapshot directory, and a save state directory. It puts them all within the PCSX2 subfolder by default, but if you have stuff where you want to put them like in a cloud drive or something, you can choose to do so here. Same thing with the PS2 saves, really. You can change where the memory cards go as well, but for the most part, it should be fine just saving within the PCSX2 folder for a majority of users. And that's going to cover it for all of our PCSX2 settings. And once you have everything in there set, those are going to be your global configuration settings for every game that you run. Again, not every game will work with those settings, and that's when you're going to want to go through and do individual game settings. So, in the menu, you could just right-click on any game, go to Properties, and then you'll be able to go through and manually change things to, like, get the game going how you need. So heading to the PCSX2 wiki, this will be linked in the description below once again, but you can just go ahead and find a listing for your games. So for example, 007 Nightfire for me. But I could scroll down to the known issues. No known workaround for the one issue that is still active, so we're not going to worry about 007 Nightfire then. Let's find Burnout 3, because I know that game can have some settings that you'd want to change. So Burnout 3 here. There we go. So here we go. Known issues for Burnout 3. Broken fog. Sun visible through walls. Street directions are visible further than they should be. Blur. Image. And the known workaround for each and every one of these is to just use software mode. So there we go. So I'm going to close out of Nightfire here. Right click on Burnout 3, Properties. Going to go to my Graphics tab here. And I'm going to change it over to software mode for rendering. And then I could just go ahead and close out of it. And if I want to verify that it is doing my per game setting, there we go. Yay. If I click on another game, go to the Graphics tab. Yay. All right, cool. Per game settings. Wonderful. So now when I load up Burnout 3... So there we go, Burnout 3 playing with its graphics completely correct. Blur effects, sun not showing through buildings, the sky's not black. Unfortunately, you are stuck at native resolution when it comes to using the software renderer. But if you press escape on your keyboard, sometimes in certain games, after you've started in software mode, you could change over to hardware mode and keep most of the effects working. Sometimes it doesn't. So as you can see, I kind of have this weird fire showing up behind me now, but it lets us get up-resing, and the sun is still not shining through things. We're getting mostly good blur effects. I'm having some VSync issues right now, so I need to go back through and change those in a little bit, but this is more of an example than anything, but there we go. So if I turn back to the software renderer, it gets rid of that weird issue I was having with that, fire effect behind me. There we go. But yeah, as you can see, the sun kind of shows through from behind things again. I don't know. It's kind of a trade-off if you want to have the up-res graphics or accurate graphics. So, just showing you the options available to you. But to get the most out of your PS2 emulation experience, I really do recommend going through and changing per game settings as needed. There are some games that just will not work without the software renderer, or work right, I should say. Most everything works now, but if you want to have the best, you will need to just deal with native resolution. But now, just for a little bit of extra stuff here, if at any time you want to load up the PS2 BIOS, you could just load up PCSX2, go into your system, and start the BIOS. And it will just boot you right into your PS2 BIOS. And then from here, you could go ahead and configure like system stuff. So you can change the clock, screen size, any of this stuff. You really don't need to. And then you could also browse your memory cards. So if you were just using the straight up 8 megabyte memory card files, you could come in here and then manually move things between memory card 1 and 2. You could also format your memory cards here. If you have a memory card you haven't used yet, a game will ask you to format it, or you could just format it in here. Doesn't really matter. Either way works. But there we go. Then another thing you could do, if you want to have a more console-like experience, you could go in and start big picture mode. And this results in UI that is similar to the PCSX2 or Aether SX2 and XBSX2 builds on Xbox. So like you go into your game list, and if you set your cover arts up, they'll show up on the right over there, and then you can just manually choose games this way. I don't really care for this personally, because if I'm on a PC, I'll just use a front end if I want this type of thing, but I mean, it's here for you if you want it. But another cool option, if you happen to have an optical drive on your computer, is you can play PS2 games directly from your PC's DVD drive. You can do that in big picture or normal mode, doesn't really matter. Just showing the option there because it was there. If you want to do it in normal, you could just go in and start a disc like this. But I don't have a disc inserted, so it's not going to work. Alright, now let's talk about multi-disc games. So there's a number of multi-disc games on PS2, and you're going to need to know how to change your discs. So I have Xenosaga Episode 2 Disc 2 loaded up right here, and if I click on New Game, it's going to ask me to insert Disc 1. So if I press Escape, that will bring up my PCSX2 in-game menu here, and I could go down to Change Disc, and it will show me all the discs within the directory that the first disc was located. So that's why I still separate my multi-disc games into subdirectories, because now I can come in here, and I can see my Disc 1, Disc 2, and I have a RetroArch M3U file in here. You don't need to worry about that, but I could just choose Disc 1. It's going to check the disc. And now it is loading up Disc 1, so I can actually start my new game. But when you get to a disc swap, that's the process on how to do it. But that's going to do it for this setup video for PCSX2. The QT builds have really brought PCSX2 emulation forward, in my opinion. It's a lot more approachable, a lot less annoying. Per game settings are just fantastic. You used to have to do so many workarounds to get per game settings, and it's just great to be able to do it all directly within one program now. And with PCSX2's compatibility continuing to increase by the day, there's just no better way to experience PS2 games on your PC. But thank you so much as always for watching today's tutorial. I hope you have found it informative and it helps you get your PS2 emulation projects up and running. Now, I do have a couple of big favors to ask here at the end of the video. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit that like, dislike button depending on how much you like this tutorial, and hit that sub button and notification bell so you can see when new videos go live on the channel. I have loads of content coming your way, and I'd love to have each and every one of you along for the ride. For anyone interested in further helping support the channel and keeping it going, you can check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Little goes a long way to keeping this place up and running and bringing this content to each and every one of you. Big shout out to all of our current backers. Thank you for believing what we do here and helping us keep it going. You're amazing, you're champions, or rock stars. Thank you so much. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we'll see you back next video.